It's episode 215 of the Author Stories podcast. I'm your host, Hank Garner. Find all of the archives of the show over at hankgarner.com, and while you're there, subscribe. The links are over in the right-hand sidebar. I'd like to tell you about some sponsors today. Russell Blake and his book, Day After Never, Blood Honor, the first book in the post-collapse series that Hugh Howey called the best post-apocalyptic series I've read in ages. When the world ends, I hope this book survives. Can't wait for the sequel. Well, you don't have to wait because you can get into the series now and read all 6 books. There's a link to it in the show notes. Also, Pico's House. Hey, authors, are you looking to take your book to the next level? Talk to my friend Crystal Pico Watanabe from Pico's House. She offers developmental editing, line editing, beta reading, and proofreading. She'll soon be launching a book interior design service, print formatting and things like that. But you can inquire about it now. She's edited over 70 novels and novellas and 130 short stories. And she comes recommended by best-selling authors such as Hugh Howey and Samuel Peralta. Most of her experiences with science fiction, speculative fiction, and middle-grade fantasy, but she enjoys all genres and will do you an awesome job. She offers a complimentary 2-page sample edit and complimentary track changes review after the edit. PicosHouse.com, and let her know you heard about it on Author Stories. Also, Dominion Rising is finally here. 23 all-new, never-before-released epic novels of fantasy and sci-fi, all for only 99 cents. This set is the talk of the industry right now, so grab your copy before you're left behind. Dominion Rising. There's a link to it in the show notes. Galactic Satori Chronicles, written by Nick Breaker and Paul E. Hicks. This raucous sci-fi adventure introduces Asher, a young man whose world is turned upside down when he discovers that his fiance's death has been directly caused by an imminent alien invasion. He and his friends channeled his anger and grief into the ultimate weapon against alien technology. Human emotions were the one thing the Kron didn't account for when they started their attack on Earth. Book 1 Earth and Book 2 Kron are now available. Galactic Satori Chronicles. My friend Stefan Boltz has a new book called Six String. Jennifer Dalton dreamed of being a singer for as long as she could remember. The dream has kept her alive throughout a childhood mixed in poverty and a broken and abusive home. When her younger brother dies and her mother takes refuge in alcohol, the emotional toil becomes unbearable. One morning she runs away, taking with her the one thing she owns, her beloved 6-string guitar. This is the story of a girl finding herself alone in the good and the bad, the friends she makes, and a choice that can rob her of everything she's won. 6-String by Stefan Boltz. Also, Series 2525. In Series 2525, you fly along on the sci-fi action adventure of Ceres Tari, a 25-year-old playboy superstar of the Zero Gravity League. He's desperately searching for his mother, long held captive among the galaxy's 500 worlds. When he too is kidnapped by a pirate fleet, forced to duel to the death to save a slave with powerful secret abilities, he determines to fight his way up the pirate ranks. Can Ceres kill his father to rescue his mother? Who will save his soul from himself? Fun science fiction with heart. Series 2525 is the must-read book of the summer. Don't miss out. There's a link to it in the show notes. Also, my good friend R.A. McCandless, his book Tears of Heaven, The Flames of Perdition, Book 1. A child of angels and humans, Dell is a sarcastic, fast-talking, dangerous, and unpredictable demon hunter. She and her partner, Marin, take their orders directly from an angel. They obey, or they'll be destroyed. It's not the job Dell wants, but it's the job she has. Normally, banishing a rogue demon back to hell wouldn't be a problem. Dell and Marin have a few centuries of experience. It's all part of the job description. But when the angel orders them to take down 3 demons at once, the job goes from bad to worse. The demons with supernatural powers and their own agenda have kidnapped children for their own nefarious ends. With angels breathing down her neck, children to save, and demons gunning for her blood, Dell is running out of time. That's exactly where she wants to be. I cannot recommend this book enough. This is urban fantasy at its very best. Tears of Heaven, The Flames of Perdition, Book 1 by R.A. McCandless. Do you like comics like I do? My friend Ed Gosney at edgosney.com runs one of the best comics blogs on the internet. Cool comics in my collection. And Ed recently published his 100 200th episode of Cool Comics in My Collection. And he's doing some cool stuff this week. He's looking at some new Marvel comics and some older DC ones I read over yesterday, and I saw that he included an old Superboy comic. And it kind of made me laugh because I loved those comics when I was a kid. And that's what I can always expect from Ed. Keeping me up to date with what's going on in comics now, while looking back and remembering the great stuff about comics in the past. Cool Comics in My Collection at edgosney.com. Successful indie authors are aware that they need a stunning cover in order to catch readers' attention and a well-edited manuscript in order to keep them turning the pages. But a well-formatted book is also an essential part of the equation. Kevin Summers, one of the premier book formatters to the indie world, is now accepting a limited number of clients for artisanal book formatting. Kevin has done a couple of my books, and his work is simply astounding. He's the very best in the business. Visit literaryoutlaw.com to get more information, and listeners to Author Stories will receive a $25 discount if they mention that they heard it on the show. Literaryoutlaw.com. Kevin Summers, artisanal book formatting. Go look him up. Stay tuned after the show for an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves' Jason Crane series, and thank you to all the sponsors for making this show possible. Now on to our show. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Sam Lightner on the show today. His new book is called Heavy Green, The Collision of Two Unlikely Missions in America's Secret War. Our mutual friend, Kyle Mills, introduced me to Sam, and any friend of Kyle's is a friend of mine. So welcome to the show, Sam.
Oh, thank you for having me, Hank.
So I begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
Well, I never intended to be a writer. I think that's probably common with a lot of writers. Right. But I was, for lack of a better term, a professional climber. And I'm a rock climber, mountain climber. And on a lark back in 1989, one of my best friends from growing up, we had gotten into climbing together. We had decided to go to Thailand. We'd seen pictures of bird's nest hunters gathering bird's nests on these big rock outcroppings in southern Thailand. It had been in National Geographic, and we were like, let's go have an adventure and try and find rock climbing we can do in southern Thailand. And this was a counter thing to where the climbing world was. The climbing world was built around the Rocky Mountains, a little bit of Patagonia, the Alps, and the Himalayas. And the idea that you would go climbing in someplace like Thailand was sort of bizarre, but we decided we were going to do it. And didn't know what we were going to get into. I had this vision of, us just like in a jungle, swamp with mosquitoes and everything. And what we fell into was paradise. We pulled up, we found our way to this beach with these 400-foot spires rising off it, and semi-naked European girls running around, and people running up and handing us curry and freshly cut pineapple. And it was just not what we expected. I had the greatest 3 weeks of my life, got on an airplane to fly home, and sat down and said, I have to write down what just happened to me. This was the greatest trip ever. And sure enough, it was published in one of the climbing magazines, and they said, you ever do anything like this again, you write something for us. And I wound up doing things in Southeast Asia and then all over the world, and would write these articles about these odd destinations, and accidentally ended up with a resume. So that's how I got into writing, and I had never really intended to be a writer.
That's really awesome. In reading about you and trying to familiarize myself with you and your work before the show, I stumbled on this weird intersection between climbing and writing, and you talk about it on your website, in that if you would not have become a climber, you would not have become a writer, and those things are the things that fascinate me the most. Because, like you said, a lot of people that come on don't have that story of, I always wanted to be a writer. It's the only thing I ever wanted to do. It's the only thing I ever studied to do. And it's the only thing I've ever done. Most people, like you said, have some sort of experience and they want to tell about it. And there's this innate kind of storyteller gene that's in us, and then these certain things kind of trip that gene and make it go into effect or whatever. But first off, what is a professional climber? I think a lot of people hear that and they're like, what does that even mean? Like, how do you make a profession of, scaling up rocks?
Well, for me, I wasn't, I was one of the better climbers. I'd say I'd probably be in the top, 1 or 2% back then of skill, but really only the very best, maybe 5 to 10 climbers in the world were able to be paid on a salary for such companies as like the North Face Extreme Team and so forth at that time. So for me, what it was I wound up being a guy who had some sponsors. And I had photograph sponsors. So if I had a photograph that appeared in a magazine, I would get, a certain, depending on the size of the photograph or whether it was on the cover or whatever, I'd get paid for that. And I had, obviously once the articles got going, I got paid for if I mentioned products in that. And basically you're a sponsored athlete. You were not on a team. And then on top of all that, I was a guide for Exum Mountain Guides in Jackson, Wyoming. So I guided the Grand Teton. I guided people on day trips in the Tetons. So that was what a professional climber was then. Now, a professional climber, you have pretty big name sponsors. They make a pretty good living. A few of them do. A good friend of mine, Alex Honnold, he's all over the news these days. He's been on 60 Minutes, and he recently soloed El Capitan, free soloed El Capitan in Yosemite, and there's going to be a feature-length movie coming out about him next year and so forth. So those guys are now making a very good living as professional athletes. But when I was, it was a hand-to-mouth type thing, and I was also flipping real estate in Jackson and doing other things to go along with it. But when I say a professional climber, I was actually getting paid for it, but it's more that's
what occupied your mind.
Yeah, it's climbing becomes something for a lot of people. It's not just a sport. It becomes a complete lifestyle. You build your entire life around how you're going to, your time in each day, your time in each week and each month is fit in between climbing days and rest days, trips you're going to take. Your food is based on, whether you're trying to gain muscle that week or lose weight, all sorts of things like this. It just becomes a complete lifestyle, much like being a professional basketball player or a professional football player would be, even though you're not actually getting paid that much money. And of course, as I said, now these guys are getting paid, but back then it wasn't that much money. It was more around, photo sponsorship type stuff and the guiding. And I used the term as much to show that there was a lifestyle as to show that there was a financial connection to it as well.
Sure. And this may, I know this is going to sound, like someone who's completely out of touch with the sport asking this question, but what is it about climbing that was so intriguing to you? I think a lot of people just don't understand what the draw is to that sport.
It's pretty hard to put your finger on it.
I'm sure.
Yeah, it's we can come up with things like, well, simian traits from evolution, it ties us back into our past and, the inner parts of our brain. We're pulling your way up things, attaches you to something deeper in your mind. We can do that. We can go with, it takes me to beautiful places and so forth. We can go with also, if you picture a rock climb, it's almost like a dance routine. The harder they get, the more there's a particular routine you have to follow. Like if you go with your left hand when you should have gone with your right hand, you're now out of sequence and you're going to fall off. You'll be caught by the rope. But you have to look at it almost like it's a chess game and figure out the combination of holds for your hands and feet to use so that you can get up it. So it's very mentally while physically engaging. We can look at all these things, but I don't know that any one of them actually says why it becomes this thing that pulls people into it. But it really does. I mean, I was out climbing yesterday and at the cliff I was at, there were a dozen people, and they weren't from, most of them weren't from my town in Lander, Wyoming. They were from various places in the western U.S. And I knew most of them because they were people who had also built their lives around climbing. And so that I had run into them in other places. And it's not an uncommon thing within climbers that it just takes over your life. But why? There's a whole bunch of reasons we can come up with, but no single one of them applies to any one person. So I really don't know.
You were raised in Wyoming,
yes,
right?
Yes.
Yeah. What were the things you were interested in as a kid that you look back on now and see that those things kind of formed your sense of adventure, or maybe your style of storytelling, the way you communicate what it is that you do with the rest of us who don't do what you do?
Well, I can say that my adventure side definitely comes from growing up in Jackson, Wyoming. And this is a Jackson, Wyoming that is quite different from Jackson that exists now. Jackson's a pretty developed place, let's say. It's become a place with lots of extremely wealthy people and giant homes, and it's a very busy community. It was a pretty laid back community when I was a kid, and as I mentioned earlier, my friend Mark and another friend John, that both their families were into climbing, and so that drew me into it. But I also grew up out at the base of the ski area in Jackson, and there were no other kids, or just a few other kids that were at differing ages that lived out in that little part of the community. So we were 12 miles from the main town, and I ended up having to do a lot of things just playing by myself. Also only had 2 channels on the TV, so playing outside often meant climbing trees, exploring, going up to some cliffs up on the ski hill and exploring that. I just did a lot of exploring right out my back door. And that probably tied me into climbing because the type of climbing I like to do is doing first ascents, we call it. It's doing a climb that no one else has ever done. I like doing that more than anything else. And I've realized as I've gotten older that's really a sense of exploring. It's just instead of exploring going across the Amazon jungle or trying to be the first to sail around the world or something, it's exploring in a vertical format. I'm just looking at 100 feet of rock and going, all right, how am I going to figure this out? No one else has ever done it. So I'd say that exploring thing is what really got me going into climbing, which got me into writing. And I have a hard time figuring out, though, how I became a person with, as the writing industry calls it, a voice. I've been credited with that a few times in reviews, that Sam Lightner's voice, blah, 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 comes through. And there's nothing I ever worked on. I write the way I speak. and which can drive some editors crazy. But I write the way I speak, and apparently that translates into something on paper or on screen as it is these days. And I don't know. I don't really know how I did. I never worked at it, and I'm not exactly sure where it came from. My mother tells me that I used to tell stories when I was real little. I used to just tell stories and just make things up as I was going along when we were driving places and stuff. I don't remember this, but I don't know. Maybe it's just something you're kind of born with. I don't know.
I think that's more true than not. Now, whether you argue that everyone has the storytelling gene and some people, discover theirs and some people don't, I don't know. But I do think that there are certain people that just have the knack for communicating stories. I don't know what it is, but that, and then I think you can always work to make it better, to add some craft to the gift, if you will. But yeah, I think that's true. When you, so Thailand was that first kind of expedition that you went on outside of your normal surroundings? Yeah,
I would say first outside of where I knew what I was going to be getting into.
Gotcha.
I could go on a climbing trip to Colorado or to desert Southwest, and I didn't know exactly what specific adventure I would be getting into, but I knew roughly where I was going. Thailand, we just showed up with, our backpacks on. We're like, all right, let's try and find these rocks that we've seen pictures of. And there we went.
But when you got there, I'm sure that not only was the terrain different, and you're looking at a new set of challenges, but the complete surroundings and the people and all that were different. How did you kind of process not only this is a new rock to climb, but this is a whole new culture and all of the things that go along with that?
Well, Thailand specifically is they've done an excellent job in making that country into a traveler's heaven. In that everyone in Thailand gets at least 9 years of English education. So Thai language they've got 5 different tones. It's an incredibly difficult language for our English ears to pick up on. So you can say something like cow, 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 cow. And that's the color white, the food rice, the verb to eat, and the word mountain, depending on the tone that you use with the same spelling. So we don't pick up on that, but the Thais, fortunately, seem to do a pretty good job of picking up on English. So you go over there and you can get around with pretty much anybody that's under the age of 75 is going to be able to speak some English. And that was extremely helpful. If I had showed up in Burma, it might have been a slightly different situation. But showing up in Thailand, they were ready to take care of you. Go, oh, you're looking for these rocks. Well, you need to go to Krabi province. And then you get to Krabi province, you get off a bus and there's a dozen folks standing on going, oh, I can take you right to that. Get in my boat. And then there's its own little adventure. You're not exactly sure where you're going, but sure enough, they did take me right to it. So we got to where we wanted to go real easily. We just, when we left, didn't know whether it was going to be easy or not. So Thailand's a really good place to have your first big traveling adventure, I would say.
So you started wanting to communicate these experiences that you were having with other people and started writing articles and things like that. But you've written several books, these true life adventure books and some even some nonfiction kind of how-to books. How did you kind of graduate to that level?
Editors. I find magazine editors very difficult. They always want to tell you what to do.
Yeah.
And if you write the book, you kind of get this feeling that, you know what, I get to write what I want to if I write a book. Now, of course, then you later find out when you go to sell that book that no one wants to read that. So yeah, I think every writer has a book or two in their desk that has not been placed. I know I've got two of them. So it's not exactly like that. But the first time I thought, all right, I'm gonna write a book, I had a whole bunch of things that I wanted to write about that I could not get the editors at the climbing magazines to say, yeah, we'll cover that. So I essentially wrote a guidebook to a bunch of different areas in the world. And I did it not because I really wanted to draw climbers to those areas as much as I wanted to tell the story of those areas. And those are places that I did not sell stories necessarily to in the climbing magazines. So that's actually what drew me to it. And then since then, people have come to me with some ideas, and I've come across things that were interesting ideas. I wrote a book called All Elevations Unknown, for instance, and that book was I found out about this story. We were trying to find this mountain that we had seen a picture of in a German dictionary or a German encyclopedia. We'd just seen this black and white picture, pre-World War II picture of this mountain. And we're like, we have to climb that. And so we started researching it. And then from researching that mountain, we found out about this story of this guy who dropped into Borneo during World War II to gather intelligence on the Japanese and ended up creating an army of headhunters that fought the Japanese. And I was like, that's such an amazing story. I want to write about that. And I'm going to go climb that mountain at the same time. So I'll tell both those stories. You sort of just stumble across things. And with Heavy Green, as another example, as I told you earlier, I found out about this what we call karst formation that exists in Southeast Asia. I found out about it in Thailand, but this rock formation runs from southern China all the way down to Borneo. So it's an enormous rock formation, and it's at its highest in Laos, on the Laotian Vietnamese border. So I started studying the best source of information I could on Laos and Vietnam, and that was the military. So I started studying military history, and that's how I found out about the story of Heavy Green. So again, the climbing shines through. I come across this by researching climbing stuff. I find this amazing story that is about our military times in Southeast Asia. And didn't expect to find that. Wasn't looking for that story, but it just jumped out at me, and I wound up saying, I've got to write this book. So,
well, those are always the most fascinating things. We all know the surface story, but it's the thing behind the thing that really, grabs our attention and makes us feel like we're kind of a part of the story, and maybe that we know something that is unknown to everybody else. As a writer, and as you discover these things that you're going, how do you kind of pinpoint these odd pieces of information, and then how do you create a narrative around it? You've been in some reviews, people have said that your nonfiction work reads like a paperback thriller. How do you kind of convey that immediacy and the getting into the technical aspects of it while making it absolutely readable and grabbing people's attention?
Well,
and I know that was like 12 questions.
Steer me back to it if I go astray. First off, nothing by someone of my intelligence is ever written. It's rewritten. You try and get the ideas down first, and then you come back to it and rewrite it. There's occasionally your Mozart out there who, was famously in the movie Amadeus. He wrote his, they're like, okay, well, where are his outtakes from these symphonies? And his wife says, oh, he doesn't have outtakes. He just writes it down as he hears it in his head, and this is it. So, he'd write his his piano concerto, and there would be no changes to it. He didn't even have to erase anything. I'm not that guy. So I try and get the initial story that I want to convey down, and then I come back to it and start looking at these other things that you mentioned. Some stuff you have to keep in mind. One, there's a number of old adages. One of them is write what you know. And I would say, you if you're going to write about something like a battle that took place in Laos, you better know that subject really well, so that all of that information is coming into your head as you're going through various scenarios that you're going to write about. You're picturing a scene. All right, what takes place in that? And for me, all my travel and climbing travel in Southeast Asia, I've got a scene in that book, for instance, where my lead character, who's from Wyoming, he's staring at the dirt at night. He's staring straight at the ground. And what he's trying to do is to adjust his night vision. And I remember actually having to do that to try and I'd been stuck on a climb until too late, and I didn't have my headlamp with me. And so I had to try and darken my eyes out, by not looking up at the sky, so that I could see as I was going through the jungle and try and find my way down. So it only made sense to me from what I'd been through in climbing that a guy in the military might be trying to adjust his eyes to the night so he could see movement by staring at the ground, because then your eyes get used to a much darker scenario. So, write about what you know. And that's an example of one little thing that I knew that I could put in there. And then something else that's always going on in our lives that thriller writers really do understand is there's always got to be a ticking clock. There's got to be something coming up that's going to, the bomb's going to go off at some point. The matriarch of the story is going to pass away of heart disease or whatever. There's got to be something that's going to happen that a bunch of the story has to take place before that. And if it doesn't, it's going to be a complete disaster, right? Or there is a complete disaster that's going to happen and it's coming. So what's going to load up before that complete disaster? Who's going to accidentally get involved in this thing? So you have to remember you have to keep that ticking clock, and you have to keep reminding people of the clock. And you can do that in a bunch of different ways. You can literally have a ticking clock, or you can just have people bringing up certain subjects that remind the reader of it. And that's not something that just happens in thriller novels. That's going on right now. You could have, for instance, right now, there's a ticking clock in the news of North Korea. And we don't know that something terrible is going to happen. But if you're going to write about it, you're going to end up writing about it in such a way that is going to entice people. And those people are going to be enticed by the fact that, something might happen. Therefore, the clock is ticking towards that possible event. It's just how the world actually works. We're moving forward in time, and you have to just remind, when you're writing, you have to remind the reader that this event is coming up, and don't forget about it, because it's what the whole story hinges on. Right. Did I get there?
I think that's
there. Did I?
Yeah, I think that's excellent advice. So what were these key elements in Heavy Green that grabbed your attention, and what was this untold story that made you say, "Oh, I've got to write this book"?
Well, obviously, the world knows now we were in Laos, but in 1961, we in the North Vietnamese signed a pact, a Geneva Convention pact that said we would not be in Laos militarily. And of course, the North Vietnamese already had an entire army in Laos and had no intention of coming out. And we realized, all right, they're not coming out. So we started to put together our counter to them. So it was a secret war in that on the surface, everyone in the world was supposed to think there was nothing going on in Laos, but there actually was a huge amount going on in Laos. The Vietnamese at one point had over 100,000 people in Laos. And we had just a few operatives, but we had this surrogate army working for us as well. And then we had an enormous bombing campaign going on. And so right there is your secret that, okay, it's out of the bag now, but it's not something that most people know about. We all have seen movies that have taken place, and we know of all the stories that have taken place in Vietnam. But there was this other theater, this hidden theater of war that was going on that hasn't been thoroughly covered. So that was my secret thing that and then within that, there was this one particular mountain that I had read about from looking for climbing venues. I had read about this mountain and come to find out that the United States had put basically an air traffic control center on top of this mountain. And it was completely surrounded by the Vietnamese, but it was a very steep, rocky mountain that we could have defended. And that air traffic control center was directing bombing around Hanoi to stop the flow of materials to South Vietnam. And that flow of materials was completely it was everything to the South Vietnamese war that was going on. North Vietnamese getting weapons to the Viet Cong and getting weapons to their soldiers in South Vietnam who were fighting. And therefore, it was of absolute importance for us to stop it. And there's your ticking clock is they realize they've got to get rid of this air traffic control center. And we realize this air traffic control center is really effective. So we've got to keep it there. And that's the buildup is how are they going to either get rid of it or we're going to keep it? And at some point, push is going to come to shove. That's the ticking clock. So, a real set of events that really did have a ticking clock going on.
I love it. I love it. When you set out to write this book, were you concerned that the subject matter was different from the things that you had done in the past? Did you kind of see it as a challenge, or what sorts of things did you do to make sure that you got the facts right? Because this is kind of a little separated from your typical wheelhouse.
Yeah, I'll tell you, my initial plan was to write the book as two stories going side by side, which is how I wrote All Elevations Unknown. I wrote the story of the World War II stuff taking place around the mountain and the story of us climbing the mountain. And so one chapter would be telling one side and one the other, and then they eventually come together. And that was my plan for Heavy Green, was to tell the story of what was going on the mountain while telling our story of climbing the mountain. And winter of 2015, we had a particularly cold February. I was between other climbing writing projects, and I have not been able to ever get to this mountain. I'm going to try and go to it again this fall, but hadn't been able to ever climb it. And it just occurred to me, I ought to just write this as a purely historical fiction thing. And rather than try and put myself in it, I'm just going to write it all about characters that I make up and put them in it. And that just somehow wasn't that difficult to do. Again, write what you know. And I wrote, my lead character comes from Wyoming and is a climber. And I had lived in Thailand, so I've got a Thai character in there. I've got a CIA character. I've known a number of people who live in Thailand, who worked for the CIA during the Vietnam War. So I know various characters and things that they have done in their past. They've talked to me about it. So I wrote what I knew. I found that I would sit down at the computer in the morning. It wasn't a question of coming up with something to write. It was as soon as I sort of stepped into character and started writing dialogue, I could not stop writing the dialogue. There was enormous amount that these people were saying to each other, with the end goal being tell the story of the Vietnam War and tell the story specifically around this particular battle that took place. It just wasn't that hard to come up with it. It was actually quite easy. The harder part was, all right, how do I filter this down so that it is like a conversation people would have, but it's the pertinent information, because we don't want to write, a 1 million word tome. We want this thing to be, a reasonable 80,000 words or something like that. 300 pages, not 3,000 pages. So,
right. And that's the writer's challenge all the time is giving enough information, to root it in reality and plausibility, while, keeping the pace fast and the clock ticking, as you say, and keeping the reader engaged. I would imagine that writing the kinds of stuff you have in the past helped that. Do you feel like that has informed your fiction writing?
I think so. I think that, if you're writing about one particular climb that's 60 feet high, okay, instantly there's a ticking clock as soon as you leave the ground. You can't stay on that 60 feet of rock for the rest of your life. You have got to finish it. And if it's very, very steep, that ticking clock is ticking even faster. You've maybe only got 5 or 10 minutes to complete the connection of the hand and footholds that get you to the top. And if you don't make that connection in that, before your strength is gone, you are going to fail. So the whole ticking clock thing with writing, I think probably I'm just used to having ticking clocks in my life. And I can think about things in that context.
Yeah, I think a lot of us are used to having ticking clocks in our life, especially if you're raising kids. Maybe. Well, the new book is called Heavy Green, The Collision of Two Unlikely Missions in America's Secret War. Sam Lightner, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show. Where can people connect with you if they're intrigued by your story and want to find out more about you and follow you going forward?
Well, I've got a webpage, samlightnerjr.com, and Heavy Green is on that, as well as other stories about other things I've written. There's a bit of a blog involved with the page, but you can contact me through there. And then I also have an Amazon page, writer's page. And I think if you just do Sam Lightner Jr., or if you go to Heavy Green, look up Heavy Green, I think there'll be a link in there somewhere that'll carry us together.
And I'll be sure to put links to all that good stuff in the show notes, where if you just look at the show notes at hankgarner.com, you can find the links to Heavy Green and Sam's website. Thank you, Sam, for coming on the show today. I really enjoyed it.
And I really appreciate you having me on and love the show. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Tune in for new episodes every Tuesday and Friday. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Mather steepled his hands. "You asked to join us once?" Hedwig leaned forward, eagerly. "The appointed. Does that appeal?" "Yes." "Do you even know what we do?" "My grandmother used to say that you control the world. That's not far off. But why? To what end?" "I don't know. Power?" "Pour me a bourbon." Mather reached into his briefcase and produced a file folder. "I want to tell you one story. Have you ever heard of Centralia, Pennsylvania?" "No." He produced a photo for Hedwig's inspection. "Spring of 1962. A pretty little town, wasn't it? Whitewash and ticky-tacky, pastel housewives and perfect lawns. A mining community, mostly. Coal. He turned over a second photo. A lovely young woman.
There was a single witch in Centralia named Anna Lively.
Anna had a green thumb. She could make her garden grow, whisper to a flower, and send it shooting from the ground like that. Just lovely. But she was discovered. That spring, a boy named Bobby Avery received a Bell & Howell Zoomatic movie camera for his 11th birthday. Bobby amused himself by filming his neighbors, sometimes without their knowledge, through windows and over garden fences. 12 seconds of film. Just a girl and her garden patch and one swiftly blooming rose. It killed the town. Bobby showed it to his friends. Children believe readily. Bobby was the first to die. Parents looked into it, watched the film themselves, and they began to die. Anna disappeared. Perhaps they attacked her. Perhaps she escaped. But even in her absence, knowledge of a true witch was running wild through the population, as if Anna had beckoned it herself to grow verdant and spread.
The great curse had killed 64 Centralians
by the 1st of June. The footage was offered to a national news organization. That was the precipice. It might have been shown in prime time, between Leave It to Beaver and My Three Sons. We came very close to another worldwide calamity, but we were fortunate. One of our own was in place at the network. He alerted his superiors, and they ended the situation. Do you know how? I'm afraid to ask. Mather laid down another photo.
This is Centralia
today. It was an aerial view of a forest. Endless trees and underbrush cut through by lanes of pavement. Just a maze of cracking asphalt, like the foundations of Sodom, ripped bare by the wrath of God. Only a cemetery remained, on a hill overlooking the former town. A white marble angel stood among the graves, grieving for the ruins below, like Lot's wife, turned to salt. You destroyed the whole town? Not I. This was well before my time, but yes. Just as you'd cauterize a wound to stop a patient from bleeding to death. We blamed it on an uncontrollable mine fire, deep below the earth. We actually set the coal burning, in case someone investigated. It burns today. Touch any of those streets and you'll find them hot, the asphalt melting, as if the town sat just above perdition. It's not something we're proud of, but it was necessary.
To save the world. Centralia, Pennsylvania, and everyone who'd seen that film had to be sacrificed.
Mather collected the photos. So, that is why the appointed exist, and that is what we do. Still want to join?